everyone, and welcome to Strand Explains. My name is Sakshi Singhal, and today I'm super excited because we'll be getting to talk to Dr. Aditi Chatterjee about cancer genetics. So, Dr. Aditi Chatterjee is currently the AD for Research and Development at Strand, having held various roles, including adjunct faculty scientist at the Institute of Bioinformatics, before which she was at Johns Hopkins University for 12 years, where she first did her postdoctoral training and then was a member of faculty. She received her PhD from the University of Calcutta in biochemistry, and her research interests include molecular genetics and proteomic alterations that drive the progression of different types of cancers associated with tobacco, such as head and neck squamous cell carcinomas, or HNSCC, esophageal and lung cancers. Hi, Dr. Aditi, how are you?
Hi, good morning, Sakshi. Thank you for the kind and nice introduction. And good to see you, and looking forward to our, maybe I should call it a little chat.
Yeah, I'm super excited. It's so cool to get to talk to you because in the times of COVID, it's so odd. I've heard of so many people and who work at Strand, but I haven't had the chance to interact, especially face to face. So even if this is the way to do it, it's nice to get to speak to people like you. So let's start off. Like I did mention, you started your PhD in biochemistry. However, your research interests are more specific towards molecular genetics and focusing on cancer genetics. So I was wondering what got you interested in genetics, oncogenetics, and what led you there from biochemistry?
So, yeah, it's been a long journey. Yes, I did PhD in biochemistry, and that was really hardcore, like enzyme kinetics and all that. And then when I moved for my postdoctoral training in US, it was a big jump and shift. And I shifted to studying alterations or genomic alterations in cancer. But interestingly, it was using yeast Saccharomyces cerevisiae as a model. Because it's very easy to alter the genome of the yeast. I mean, like if you go back in history, that's one organism people have played innumerously because that's the first eukaryote that we study.
Yeah.
So with that, when I used to, do the editing in the yeast genome, and that's small, of course. So then it got me interested, like if the same can be applied to humans. And thereafter was my second postdoc, same at Hopkins itself, where I kind of carried over the research into human cell lines, actually, where, of course, it's not that we edited the cell line because then there was no CRISPR-Cas and all that, but we would introduce plasmids and bring in and see what this expression would lead to other phenotypic changes and all that. That's where it inculcated. And of course, with time, science evolved, the human genome got sequenced, and that was a big leap for scientific mankind, where you would then want to study more in depth the genomic alterations. And that kindled the interest further. Yes, to a large extent, we have been studying signal transduction, but also it stems from the genome. The genome is altered and then it's transcribed and translated. So, yeah, I mean, put together, you can see it's a ball which has gathered a lot of moss, and that's how, you got into it.
That makes sense. And I think that's so cool. This is a question I tend to ask everyone because I find their journey to where they are, not to say that where they are is the end, or is like where they're going to be for the rest of their lives. But it's always so interesting to see how people move around and how their interests change and evolve. And I think your career up till now is definitely a testament to how you can really work towards getting to somewhere really cool just by playing around with different things, like you mentioned, with the biochemistry and signal transduction and the yeast genome editing. So that's really cool. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk briefly about the development of tumors in the body from a genetic perspective. So like I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, our theme today is oncogenetics or cancer genetics. And I thought you might be able to just shed some light on terms of how that happens and how the development of tumors occurs from a genetic perspective.
So I guess we all know and understand that cancer is a genetic disease. I mean, there is for whatever X reason, there is a mutation which takes over the functioning of the cell. Now, with time, again, different groups and very stalwart research has showed that even if you take a piece of tumor, there's a lot of heterogeneity in the tumor. Like if you could chop the tumor into 100 pieces and sequence each individually, of course there will be overlapping, but there would be unique mutations in all. And that has also driven the thing into people today doing single cell transcriptomics, or people are talking about even single cell genomics. Yes, always it may not be cost effective for every researcher to probe into so much depth and minutiae of the genetics of the tumor or disease, but it's there. And one of the biggest things that we see, I mean, I'll just give you an example. Like suppose someone comes up with a tumor, they do a mutation analysis, and then they find that some mutation exists and there is a drug for that. So one search is like for EGFR, and they would give the drug. And then after some time, or in a large number of cases, you must have heard that a drug is administered and then it is rendered resistant. So how did this resistance come? So one of the school of thoughts, and I believe in it, is because that I said there's a heterogeneous pool of mutations. So the predominant pool of mutation is what you captured and you gave the drug. The drug did work on it. They are gone. Now, what were the remnant mutations? They start flourishing. So now this drug may not be able to work on those mutations which were otherwise in the quiescent stage. But now they have taken over the growth of the tumor. And so one would say, oh, now the drug stopped working, or the person developed resistance and so on. I mean, these are mostly when I'm saying for targeted drugs. The reason for resistance for other chemotherapeutic drugs could be totally different because they are not targeted drugs, they're analogs, right? But yeah, I mean, it's still evolving. It's a vast field. We are still learning. And the more scientists are digging into the depth and minutiae of mutation profile, even just in a given sample, not even in a cohort of patients, you understand how complicated the system is and how complicated it is to target it. I mean, when we talk to others not in the field, it's easy, or of course it's frustration probably, which says that, oh, it's years and years of research, billions of dollars are going into it, and yet there is no such solution. Like say for infectious diseases, there are solutions. People would know that, yes, I'm going to come out of it if I take at least 4 antibiotics. Such confidence doesn't exist in cancer. And one of the biggest aspect is this heterogeneity. I mean, it's almost, looking for a needle in a haystack at some points. And as I said, I mean, what one first assesses could be just the tip of the iceberg, but then you don't know what's way, way deep behind it. And sometimes time is not kind enough to allow you to do that kind of investigation. And of course, there is whether it is cost effective. And even if you know, do we know how to increase the lifespan or can we cure the disease? I mean, these are questions, right? You could throw off $1 million and do a whole lot of analysis for a given patient view, I'm saying, not from the research, from the patient view. But will it increase the lifespan that significantly worth $1 million? Or would I say, let that person live in peace? So, yeah, it's a very catch-22 situation. But coming back to where we started, like, it's a diverse ocean of anomalies within an individual tumor. And I think we are just at the tip of the iceberg, still digging and drilling deep into it before we get all the mysteries resolved.
No, that makes sense. And we've been just on our LinkedIn, for instance, in our blog posts or media, we've kind of been exploring this idea of tumor heterogeneity and, like you said, how it really does play such a large role when it comes to targeted therapies. and how it becomes a sort of cyclical thing where you identify a mutation, find the right treatment, and then overall it eventually renders non-useful or non-effective, and so then you find the next mutation, and it is kind of a cycle. And like you said, at what cost is that happening? Because it's at that point just about pushing the needle a little bit further and a little bit further. I think one of the stories we were following in our blog post is osimertinib, which is, I think it was discovered back in 2015, 2014, 2015, if I'm not mistaken. And at first it was this miracle drug, right? Because so osimertinib is used to work with EGFR mutations in NSCLC, non-small cell lung cancers. But recently, I think back in 2018 or 2019, unfortunately, it was found that there is a new resistance mutation called the C797S mutation, which is now rendering osimertinib non-functional as well. And in those cases, they're actually going back to using some of those first line TKIs, whether it's erlotinib or gefitinib. And so I was wondering if you could maybe talk, Dr. Aditi, about this kind of cyclical nature of, you have mentioned a little bit, but maybe just in the context of osimertinib and the journey it had from, discovery to it's a miracle to, okay, we need to now start figuring out what to do next because of these mutations that are coming about.
Yeah, I mean, see, because I'm not a clinician, so maybe the clinical aspect, how they are facing the challenges in clinic, I may not be able to draw a full line of justice to it. But like erlotinib, gefitinib came before osimertinib. And as you pointed out, that they figured out that is going to work for that particular mutation, I forget the name.
C799.
And then again, yeah. So now again, there is resistance to osimertinib, and they may find that, the patient might work back to erlotinib, or it may not work to any of these EGFR targeted therapies. So it's the same thing which I explained. I would believe, like when they first sequenced the tumor, they found that mutation, and osimertinib is the drug of choice. And you have eliminated those mutant cells or most mutant tumor cells. And then maybe if you resequence it, then you figure out the pool which could be targeted by the EGFR or gefitinib therapy, and you give them. I mean, that's lucky if you found that, but it could be that a tumor does not harbor it. It does not harbor any of the mutations that could be targeted by any of the EGFR therapies. Then what do you do? Mostly you would go back to the classical chemotherapy drugs, which are the analogs, because they work independent, like they would just work as DNA adults. Again, I mean, see, when a patient comes in, typically you sample a section of the tumor and you send it out for sequencing. So if it could be that I could sample, say, at least 20 sections of the tumor and then send for sequencing, possibly the result would be different. It would be that you would pick up osimertinib, but it would also probably give you the idea that what other things could be looming in sight. So, and that's what I said, like how much will it be practically possible to do it in the clinic, or in terms of science and evolving of science that has been done, that is being done. I mean, there are plethora of papers where they've taken lung tumors. They have done like 50 to 100 sections, have done such research. There are enough literature where people have not only done such tumor sectioning, but have also gone into single cell sequencing to understand the diversity of the mutation profile that exists in a given tumor. So it is adding to the bandwidth of knowledge. And with that, people will probably understand how they can tweak their findings when it comes to clinics, or maybe here bioinformaticians will come in and build some algorithm, like if this percentage shows X amount of tumor, what could be the predicted pathway of the progression? What the AI guys are doing these days, which of course is not my domain, but a lot of work is going into that.
Yes.
So I mean, yeah, with the evolvement of science and technology, and because biology is no more restricted to biologists per se, I mean, there are a lot of other, what should I say, there are a lot of other areas of expertise which has clubbed and merged in. We do see a hope and silver lining that maybe things will take a better and bigger leap for the disease management.
Like you said, it's so interesting that biology is not just done by biologists nowadays. I think that's a really cool way of looking at it, that there's so many other people involved. And actually, maybe you talk to how your interactions with other scientists have changed working in a corporate setting, where our company Strand is not just made of biologists. We have people who are very into AI. And so maybe could you talk about your experiences in terms of working with people from other domains beyond pure biology, given in a corporate setting, and how that's affected your research and the way you may think about these things?
I mean, I have started working in Strand for a year now, and what I see, it's a diverse population of scientists, whether it's a bioinformatician, or it is a statistician or a biologist. And even within biologists, there could be a cell biologist, there could be people who have more expertise in the NGS technology per se, if you say in terms of technology. And it's actually a very comfortable way of interaction and working when you have a diverse population. Because me being an experimental biologist who have kind of lived most of my life on the bench, we can design experiments, we can troubleshoot experiments, and we can even when I say design experiments, come up with new experiments. But in today's world, when there is so much of large data per se, then for us to go through in a classical pattern would have been very challenging. If I have to roll sheets and sheets of Excel, I mean, what we did when we were graduate students, that would be a very time-taking, challenging thing to do. So that's where when, people with greater technical knowledge in computer science or programming, what you call it, and we club them together as bioinformatics scientists, when they come in and they can draw the algorithm and come up with the snapshot solutions in one go, that is definitely very helpful, because you kind of get the bird's eye view, or the first thing that would pop up when you have a large data set. In addition, of course, with time, with online tools, things have developed, like how you do a pathway analysis. I mean, earlier we will have to read probably 50 articles and jot down the points and draw the dotted lines to say, the ABCD was known, but there was no mention of M and N, and now I can join the dots and show experimentally. But these days, with things like, at least what I use, the string analysis or Keck pathways, and there are hundreds of other such analysis that goes on. And many of these actually I have learned from bioinformaticians and computer scientists. So that has given you some ease of analysis of data to see what should you focus on, what could be the way forward, and not like, again, you are skimming the surface, or you are trying 5 different things, and one may work out and others give you an experimental failure. So here, confidence towards what you should pursue increases when you have such wide angle interactions and inputs from other groups.
And I think that also speaks to the nature of collaboration in science. And I was wondering, do you think that's because is it the nature of working in a corporate field versus in an academic field? Or did you see that when you were doing your more academic-based research? And how was that shift for you from more academic side of things to more corporate side of things?
So, academic research is important, because a lot of academic research is basic research. And that's what grows and gets what people call it translated. Now, one big aspect of spending sensible duration in academics is it enhances your training. And once, when you finish just your grad school, what in India we call it PhD, and then if you jump into doing a job per se, yes, you learn during the process, but there may not be. Actually, there is a time crunch when people cannot actually handhold you and teach you more, which academics does in its early years. Then, of course, you have to grow and be independent, come up with your own solution, your own ideas. And that's where you grow and you start writing grants, you get grants and you execute. And it is now your turn to train newcomers in the field, which are students. So with this training, when you shift to corporate, the big difference that I see, and I love it, is the application in corporate is very very rock solid, if I could say it. It is very focused. It is towards product development or it is towards patient care in whatever sense. I mean, even if it's patient care, you can call it a product development. In academics, yes, there are such options, but also it comes with its own things that, as I said, I mean, you have other responsibilities of, mentoring the students. You have to graduate them. You have to move ahead. So yes, sometimes PIs do stick to one single project and they just pursue it through and through. And they are the big shots in that field because they could be so focused and then, come out with novel discoveries on the field. But it's not something everybody can achieve, right? I mean, people have their own limitations in terms of funding, or there could be other limitations, I mean, as you journey in your career. So that way, what I find is corporate being very focused, and the deliverables or the utility of the corporate research to society is much higher, at least in my journey, not to offend other academics groups who have done very stalwart research and they have come up with very innovative discoveries and inventions, and they have taken things through leaps and bounds. One big example is insulin. If I say on a global scale, everybody cannot achieve that. But if you are in the right R&D setting of a corporate, you have the opportunity to contribute with the group and then take forward their research to application. I mean, that's completely my way of looking in my journey is how I look at it.
And I think that's great advice as someone who's going to start, who's just done an undergrad and is planning to do a PhD in a year or two. It's fascinating to hear that even in an academic setting, there is so much to learn, both obviously just as you said from basic research, but also in terms of collaboration and learning how to write grants and funding and things like that. And without that basic research, nothing would be possible. It is the backbone for a lot of the time for what happens in these corporate settings. And so that totally makes sense. And I think maybe on that note, would you be able to talk about the difference between a postdoc and corporate, and how those might change the way you learn and how you take in knowledge and how you may also teach a little bit the people you mentor?
I feel postdoctoral experience is important because it enhances your learning, that enhances your thought process, your ability to troubleshoot, your ability to design experiments, to come up with new project ideas, to handle the situation when there are repeated experimental failures, to handle the situation when your manuscript got rejected 3 to 4 times. How do you modify it? What extra do you put into it? Where are you lacking? Your peers have reviewed it. Why are they critiquing it? You send it out thinking you did your best. So it's a big learning phase of life. Mm-hmm. And that actually helps when you later take up any kind of job. I mean, whether you then go on to become PI in an academic setting, or do you want to come back and join a corporate? But that phase of training as a postdoctoral fellow helps a lot. And if I can speak for myself, it has helped me. I mean, what I the responsibilities I shoulder in Strand today, for example, I guess a lot of my previous learning is helping me. It's also true that I'm learning new things. I'm handling projects which I have never handled. And that's a way of learning. And I'm very, you can say, happy and excited that I'm learning these new things. Otherwise, probably I would have never opened up any of my textbooks or even have Googled such things. Unless such projects were being handled by me. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to talk about such projects, but I know there are projects I would have not read up had it not been for Strand. Yes, all those projects has application, or I can use my previous learning, but for such particular projects, again, there is additional learning. So it is what should I say? It's a give and take situation, or should I say it's a good pairing? So it's like that. So if you specifically were asking, does postdoctoral training help? Yeah, it helps. It definitely helps. I mean, anybody who has asked me, I have always said that that's never a wastage of life. Doing a postdoc doesn't mean you will always stay in academics and you cannot come to corporate, and postdocs will hardly gain anything by no, it's not like that. And I know individuals who shifted from PhD to a job in a corporate setting, and even after working for 5-6 years, they realized that their peers in the organization had postdoctoral training and somehow are maybe they are going back to do postdoc for a few years before they want to come back to their career again. I mean, I even know such mix of crowds too. So it's always helpful because you are learning. I mean, learning can never have a negative impact on life.
Definitely. And I think it's so nice to hear, and it's quite heartening to hear that you're still go back to your textbooks and still are learning. So I think it really speaks to the importance of lifetime learning as well. Just the fact that at your stage in your career, it's really cool to hear that you are also still doing that. So I think we can maybe end here. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about, discuss, or do you have any questions for me, Dr. Aditi?
No, I think I can't think of much, and I already covered.
So I think we can end there. Thank you so much, Dr. Aditi, for both an educational and very fun conversation. And thank you so much for taking the time out. It's 9 o'clock in the morning and kind of early. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Sakshi. Thank you for having me over. Of
course.
And I look forward to meet you in person someday. I mean, we have met virtually, but we should meet in person someday.
Definitely, I would love that. Thank you so much, Dr. Aditi. Goodbye.
Okay. Bye then.